into the shadows, where I hope you find peace in the dark. These videos are handpicked week by week, and if you find yourself enjoying the content, make sure to bring your flashlight and leave a like, because it's always dark in the shadows. Without further ado, let's get into it. And before I forget, I now have a Discord and Instagram for all of you to follow along with. Feel free to check it out, chat with each other, and share stories even. Anyway, back to the story. Before I begin, I just want to say that it may have well been some kind of strange, rabid coyote that I encountered out in the Gila River National Forest, but maybe it was something else. I'm not sure what I believe. 4 years ago, I was on a camping trip in the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. I am from a small town in the Arizona-New Mexico border called Duncan. Don't worry, you've probably never heard of it and probably won't ever, but now I live in St. Louis, Missouri. When I say small, I don't mean doesn't have a Walmart small. I mean, if I stood on the roof, I could see where the town ends, kind of small. But it was good upbringing, if extremely boring. I had a week off from work, and we had been planning this trip for months. I was taking a few really good friends of mine back to where I'd hike in high school. My best friend Dave, his brother Daniel, and brother's girlfriend Ida, who had grown long tired of the Idaho jokes made her whole life, partially by me and Dave, and now we went to a shortened middle named Beth. Obviously, I wouldn't include the last bit if it wasn't important, so keep that in your back pocket for now. We were all experienced campers and outdoorsmen by that age, and Daniel had actually met Beth partial hiking in the Appalachian Trail. Dave and I had spent a long time doing walkabouts in the Ozarks and Smokies, with one trip up to the Boundary Waters where we had lost a pack in a capsized canoe and had to survive off the land for a few days before we got into something with a satellite phone. This is important because you need to understand that we all knew our way around the wild. We didn't scare easily and knew that 9 times out of 10 animals were more afraid of us than we are of them. Just as an aside, typically these stories are annoyingly vague when it comes to location and details, especially the ones people say are legitimate. So I will copy and paste a plan for a trip below. Any local will tell you that these are real places and people do go backpacking here. The plan was to start from Silver City and go 42 miles north on the 15 and turn left towards Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, continue 1 mile to the West Fork Trailhead, walk a half mile back to TJ Corral Trailhead, climb Little Bear Canyon, then hike down to the Middle Fork Gila River Canyon, follow the river upstream, and set up camp around a 6-mile marker. After the day hikers are gone, backtrack to the hot springs before dinner. The next day, continue up the Middle Fork to set up camp at the Meadows. I called it Matthews Flats in high school. The next day, take Pryor Creek and Lilley Park trails, crossing plateau grasslands to the rim of Hell's Hole Canyon. Take Hell's Hole Trail 268 to West Fork Trail 151, follow it 12 miles to the end, and there's a great campsite under a rocky alcove near Hell's Hole Trail Junction if we make it there in good enough time. If this story doesn't disillude you, then I'd recommend this backpacking trip. But I won't be going back there, that's for sure. On our first night, we made camp exactly where we were supposed to, around 6 miles from the trailhead, down the middle fork of the river. We found a nice quiet spot by the river bank, about 40 feet from the water. It was dark, and the fire was small, but warm. And the food that you'd make camping always tastes better than when it's cooked at home. We were quiet, and the stars overhead seemed close enough that you could reach your hand out and you could brush them away like sand from a blanket. The only light came from half-moon hung low in the sky, through the scrubby leaves of the trees above and our fire. The euphoric peace was crushed by the absolutely unmistakable sound of coyotes that echoed throughout the trees behind us. Those who have never heard them may say, they're basically dogs, they sound like barking, but that is not the case. Coyotes cry and shriek and yap. Some people think they sound like children crying out in pain. Beth heard them for the first time and turned her flashlight to the north. We could tell they were a long way off. But when you hear something like that, you instinctively look for a source. Daniel said we could pack up tight tonight, and we didn't need any scavengers like that getting into our food or our trash. We agreed even though the likelihood of anything getting close to us was very slim. Bears had been slightly sighted recently, so it was better to be safe than sorry. So we repacked anything that could attract unwanted attention, and in the process let the fire die down to embers, all the while hearing the crying to the north. It was then we all saw it, a single coyote, sitting in the dark and watching us about 30 to 40 yards out of our camp next to a small mesquite tree. We could see its shining, iridescent eyes in the dark, thanks to the little fire that we had left, and they shined bright like emerald mirrors when flashlights were shined in its direction. We heard his pack to the west again, but he didn't react beyond turning an ear to that direction. Dave asked if he could shoot it since coyotes are vermin around here, but we all said no. It hadn't done anything, and maybe it'd just been curious. Dave had a .5 Smith & Wesson revolver as black bear deterrent, and he kept it in a leg drop holster in his left leg. It was getting late, and we had a big hike the next day, so after getting everything was put away, we got into our tents and went to bed. I didn't sleep too well that night, and every time I looked through the mesh window of my tent, I saw those two unflinching iridescent orbs in the dark. The coyote was gone when we woke up. We broke camp and buried the fire. Not disturbing the environment was important to us, and we had made sure to leave nothing but footprints. Beth and Daniel were the first to notice something wrong, though. The mesquite tree that the coyote was close to was much bigger in the daylight, and there were absolutely no tracks to be found. Dave quickly explained that it was too dry for footprints, and the coyote was probably closer than we thought last night in the dark. I wasn't convinced. We were camped on a riverbank, so in theory it should have been at least a little wet, but there was no need to incite a panic over nothing. Plus, it was gone at this point, so I thought, who cares? We had 2 more days to the plateau with a night at the top, and when we got about a half hour into the hike, Daniel stopped. He was sure he had his knife the night before, but it was now missing from his sheath on his pack. He decided that we should go ahead and he would run back to the campsite. It should only put him about an hour behind us, less if we walked slow, and he had plenty of experience on his own. Besides, we got smart and Daniel rented a satellite phone for about $50 for the week. So if he got in trouble, he could call the park rangers. He said he would be back long before dark, and when we had a camp set up, and he should have been, the trail at the point wasn't that tough. And he wasn't. We set up camp in the meadows, got a fire going, and the sun had set at last and was leaving the sky. The reds and the pinks of the sunset gave way to the purples and blues of night. We were discussing whether or not to send someone out to look for him when we heard fast, heavy footsteps. He was running, winded and trying to say something. He didn't have his backpack. Bear, I thought, and looked at Dave, who already had his gun out, ready to put down whatever came up the trail after his brother. Daniel was gasping for air. He collapsed at Beth's feet, holding himself up with his arms. Beth screamed, asking if he was alright, what was wrong, if he was hurt. Meanwhile, I reached into my pack and retrieved my camp axe. It wasn't much, but it was better than the small 3-inch knife I kept in my hip pocket. Nothing came after Daniel. He was still panting when he turned over to sit up on the ground. "It's not a coyote," was all he could say for about the next 15 minutes behind drinks of water from a camelback and gasps of air. He repeated it over and over. I looked at Dave, who had never seen his brother like this. Daniel was an Eagle Scout and a fairly large guy at about 6'2" and 200 pounds, and wasn't the type to get spooked by an animal, even a big one. Beth never let go of him as we made food that night. One of the tents, some of the food, his sleeping bag, and 2 of the large cooking bag had been in his bag. A day hiker actually found it and was sent back to him some weeks later. It was torn a bit, but nothing was missing. Always put your info on the stuff, kids. There's still good people left, although not many. When we got a hold of himself and he was able to breathe normally, he told us what had happened, punctuated by deep breaths and a vacant look as he was trying to decide if what he had just experienced had actually happened to him. He said that he had almost reached the river when he realized how quiet it was. He heard no birds, no bugs, no wind. He barely heard the river, which at this point was little more than a trickle. When the night before, it was shallow, but at least 15 feet across. He looked up the trail to see a coyote from the night before, but standing on 2 legs like a man, 40 feet from him. He said it stood about 6 feet tall and didn't dance around at all, trying to stay up like a dog who was trained to balance on 2 legs. He made it a point to mention that its mouth was closed as it just stared at him. A deep, primal fear seized him and triggered his freeze instinct. He said he locked eyes with it for a minute that seemed like hours. When he finally had the sense to try backing away, no sooner than the thought had entered his head, the coyote let out the most unnatural coyote cry he had ever heard. He said it wasn't deafening in a sense that your ears are left ringing, but it was deafening in the sense that the noise is all you can hear even after it stopped. Daniel wasn't stupid enough to think that he could outrun a coyote, especially one of this size who was clearly not afraid of him. So he had to think quick. He slowly took a step back, fully expecting the animal to charge, but it didn't. Too afraid to look away, he crouched down and felt for a rock, a big stick, something, if at anything, to defend himself, but there were nothing more than small pebbles to pick up near him. It began to move its mouth, and Daniel stood up. The animal's eyes rolled back in its head and slowly opened its mouth, too wide to be natural. He showed me a picture of an animal called a thylacine, and told me its mouth looked like that when we got back after all this. It's an extinct dog, like the thing from Tasmania that could open its mouth to something like 130 degrees. Look it up if you have the time. This obviously put him over the edge. His flight spots kicked in, and he took back off towards us, an hour away, running full tilt back down the hill. He heard the coyote cry one more time, a few seconds later as deafening as ever. He heard the shifting of gravel behind him and the sounds of footsteps. The coyote was running after him. Whether it was on 2 legs or 4, Daniel didn't know. But he didn't risk slowing back down to look back and see. He was horse-collared by his pack a few feet later. From his knees he slipped it off and ran as fast as he could. He knew the coyote would have been on him within 20 yards, but there were no footsteps behind him anymore. He ran as long as he could before he slowed to a walk, winded, and he turned around to see nothing. He heard a snap in the forest to his right, and he saw as it reared up on 2 legs again. He couldn't run far, but it was the only chance he had. He stopped to walk whenever he was too tired to run anymore, and every little twig snapping or rustling in the forest became the coyote in his mind, driving him forward. Eventually he could see our firelight through the trees and broke out into a sprint. He said he nearly passed out more than once after pure fear kept him running. Obviously at this point our trip was over. We had half the food, half the tents, and not to mention whatever was following us. We didn't have much choice regarding what to do with the night, though. It was dark, and we had to try and hike back out the next day. Daniel wouldn't sleep unless someone kept watch, so we slept in shifts. The tent we had left was a 3-person tent, so that Dave and I could keep our packs inside with us and all the other supplies while we slept. So it wasn't a real big deal, but surely an inconvenience. It wasn't that big of a deal to cram 3 of us in while the other one kept watching. We stayed up between the tent and the fire for an hour, and we would sleep 3 hours while the others took their turn. Dave left us his revolver with instructions to shoot to wound, not to kill, but not to hold back any follow-up shots if necessary, just in the case we were shooting at something that wasn't our coyote. God forbid we shoot a person hiking in the woods at the night for some reason. He took first watch, Beth took second, and I took third. Beth woke me up around 1:30 a.m. She was visibly scared. Before I could say anything, she put a finger over her lips and covered her mouth with one hand. She was silently crying and looking at Daniel. I got up out of the tent and looked around. The forest was still, except for the wind in the trees. The wind blew the tall grass, and it bent as if an invisible hand brushed the tops of the blades. Visibility was obviously limited, but we could see the tree outline surrounding most of the meadow. Beth and I silently looked at each other and the surrounding area for about 5 minutes before speaking. I wondered why on earth she woke me up instead of Daniel when she finally spoke. In a low whisper, she told me, "I heard my name." With tears still slowly rolling down her cheeks, trying to remain rational, I told her it was okay and we were all shaken up, and that the wind bending the branches could conceivably make a "beh" sound, and blowing through the leaves could make a "th" sound, forming Beth, but she was shaking her head. I didn't hear Beth. The hairs on my neck and arms stood up. She swore that she had heard Daniel's voice coming from the trees calling her name. She looked into the tent to see if he was still there, and when he was, she was too afraid to wake him. I stayed awake with her for the remaining half hour of her shift, and to hear what she may have heard, but the noise was only the occasional bug and the sound of the wind, the standard night sounds. After a long while she settled down enough and was able to at least try to go back to sleep in the tent, we were so focused on listening that when it was my turn to take watch, the fire had died down to almost nothing. This gave me something to occupy my time after Beth went back into the tent, so that was okay. Unfortunately, rebuilding the fire took less than 15 minutes, and I was left to do nothing with all my time, to be alone with my thoughts for the remaining 45. This was the first time I had really got to think about what was happening and how ridiculous it sounded. I believed them, though. Beth and Daniel, growing up on the border of New Mexico, gave me countless opportunities to talk with native Navajo people. I knew that what was out there perfectly fit the description of a skinwalker, an evil Navajo medicine man who inherited the ability to shapeshift into different animals if he wore their skin. I had seen some weird stuff in the desert as a kid, but nothing like what Daniel said he saw. We weren't that far from the res. That's what we called the reservation. So it made sense, but they didn't actually exist, right? Plus, I was told I didn't have to worry about them. A native kid that I went to high school with had told me that was ridiculous as it sounds, they can't hurt white people. But now I obviously wasn't sure. I thought it was just superstition, so I never asked how to actually fight these things. I began to fear an encounter. What if it actually was real? If so, why did it want us? What would I do if it attacked? Would bullets hurt it? If not, what then? And would I die out there in the wild, victim of some kind of ancient ritual? My fear turned into dread. How would it kill me? My death was inevitable in my mind, but we could call the rangers or police or something, but it would take them hours to reach us, minimum. But by then it would be way too late. Looking back now, I think I was being irrational, but I know that all of a sudden, deep-rooted fear is a sign of a supposed skinwalker nearby. However, my shift was almost done. I had forgotten about the gun beside me on the log that I was sitting on. Almost didn't hear it. A twig snapped off in the brush, though waves of heat and sparks escaping the fire, 2 iridescent orbs shone amidst the darkness and in the meadow before me. My heart was in my throat. I shot up off the log, raised the gun, and the eyes disappeared in the dark. Did I imagine it? Was I so afraid of this thing that I'd envisioned its eyes locking with mine through the flames? The cry almost 90 degrees to my right shattered my thoughts. It couldn't have moved that far and that fast, could it? Or was there more than one? It sounded like a coyote, just one high-pitched shriek, but that wasn't the only sound over there. Over a year later, I would be at an outdoor concert. I was one of the first people in the gates, and the sound tech had not muted one of the mics on stage. When a gust of wind blew through the empty amphitheater and reached the mic, I froze. The low, quiet rumble of the wind emanating from the subs that shook my core froze me in my tracks. That was and is as close as I can come to describing the noise beneath the singing shriek of what I heard. I turned. There off to my right, standing upright, was the thing. Its forelegs weren't raised in a big position like a dog does when they try and stand up on theirs, but hung awkwardly downward in front. Its mouth was closed and it stared down from me at the tree line some 90 feet away. I heard Daniel gasp in the tent next to me. He knew it was back. Beth stifled a scream through her hands. Through more sheer terror than I have ever experienced, I unloaded 3 shots into its direction, forgetting about all the aforementioned plan to shoot to wound. The gun kicked way harder than I anticipated, and at least one of my shots flew far into the treetops above the creature. I think I hit it with 1 shot, though, because it took a step back on 2 legs. I saw its mouth open then. I saw every tooth on its bottom jaw, and they were all pointed at me. The animal shook its head once, and then with speed unlike anything that I had ever seen, it ran straight across the meadow, right for me, still on 2 legs. The others came pouring out of the tent now as all of this had taken place over the course of less than 20 seconds. I fired again before it took too many steps, and I for sure hit it this time in the chest. After this hit, it dropped down on all fours, jerked 90 degrees, and off in one direction. It ran toward the tree line behind the tent, and it picked up speed as it disappeared into the tall grass. I fired 1 more shot where I thought it would be, and Dave yelled at me to stop. The revolver was a 5-shooter, and he didn't have much ammo, let alone didn't bring any. He thought he would only use a revolver against bears, and figured, you can't put a bear down with 5 shots. It's over for you anyway. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Its image haunts me to this day. It pops up in my head from time to time, and I can't help but to dwell on the living image in my head. Eyes rolled back, mouth opened too wide, like a thylacine, and as it gave a cry from another world. I gave the revolver back to Dave, and He reloaded it with what little ammo he had left, just a small pocket-sized 20-round box with only 15 left before he reloaded. None of us slept that night. We packed up camp and waited by the fire until first light. The plan was to begin hiking as soon as we could see and call park rangers to get us and meet us on the trail as soon as they could. We knew it would be more than a day's hike, but if the rangers could meet us on quads or ideally a truck, we could get to the imagined safety of trailhead rather quickly. We called and told them that we'd been attacked by something in the night. It turned out the guy who answered, Roderick, was Navajo, got real quiet as he described what we saw. In a very serious tone, he said that they'd bring out 2 side-by-sides and they'd get out in the next few days to take care of the issue, as he said. He also told us that if we saw it again, not to look it in the eyes. He said he knew what it was and that we were lucky a few bullets deterred it for now. Hiking back down the trail, we were all extremely on edge. Every movement in a corner of our eyes was the thing. All of us had weapons out, silently walking, eyes constantly scanning. Dave, who was in front with the gun, stopped momentarily, causing all of us to. Not 10 minutes from our camp was the body of an elk. It wasn't torn in half, its entrails didn't spill out all over the trail in a bloody mess, but the skin was gone, and the head. And something had eaten much of the top rear leg, but was largely untouched by scavenger animals of the forest. We would have heard a hunter the day before, and no trophy hunter would leave the carcass in the middle of the trail. I don't even know if it was elk season, and I don't think that thing wanted us to find it. It wanted us to know what it was capable of and what it planned to do to us. We didn't see a single animal the rest of the hike, living or dead. When we heard the motors of the side-by-sides heading up the trail, we all breathed for what seemed like the first time since we broke camp. Roderick was driving the first one. He asked if we were all okay and if we'd seen it again, but no. We all said no, but we told him about the elk, which he completely brushed off and told us to get into the vehicles. He didn't really want to talk about what he thought it was, but I knew. He had us fill out a report, and upon getting to the ranger station, but told us to hang around here for a few minutes. He walked out of the station with us and told us that he didn't know exactly what we saw because he wasn't sure, but to him it sounded like something that his people don't talk about. Since they get power from verbalization of their name, they feed on fear. He also told us that it would make him feel better if we received a blessing from a good medicine man on the res. Beth wanted us to go. She wanted all of us to go and just leave the place behind and get out of New Mexico. But Roderick drove us out to our car, and we spent the next 3 days with family back home. After that, we drove to Phoenix and flew back to St. Louis. I still wake at night when I hear coyotes crying, howling, chirping, whatever you wish to call it. They live in the woods behind my house, and I always go back to sleep when I realize that they're just coyotes and nothing more, when I don't hear the chest rumbling whisper beneath her cries. I do still hike and backpack, but it took me a while to get back out. Out of the hundreds of times that I've been out, this was the only time that I've ever been attacked by anything. I have gotten into Native American paranormal sightings since, because if skinwalkers are real, and I'm not necessarily saying they are, we may have simply been attacked by some kind of rabid coyote that learned to stand. And at this point, I almost believe it, but if they are real, why not Wendigos? Why not the Whistlers? Why not Sasquatch, the big water snake, or Piazza bird? Unfortunately, there's not really a satisfactory ending to my story because it's not a story. It is reality. There is no edgy cliffhanger or goosebumps introducing the final line. That's it. That's my story. And if you have one, I'd love to hear yours. So please, in the comments below, feel free to leave your story, and I hope you like tonight's.